Okay, Avtar Meher Baba ki jai. I'll start with page 37. But the tragedy is this, that as soon as the gross consciousness of the soul tends to reach the 0 point of equilibrium by gradually experiencing the predominant opposite impressions, it so happens that the consciousness of the soul invariably gets too engrossed in experiencing the predominant opposite impressions and experiences them or exhausts them to such a degree that these predominant opposite impressions are now reduced, that is, through experience, to such a level that those impressions which were overbalanced by the original predominant opposite impressions now become predominant, and a great disturbance of balance or equipoise occurs. Wherefore, consciousness, acting like the indicator at the fulcrum, swings or switches in just the opposite direction of its original experience. So it's basically the predominance of the opposite impressions taking sway. I will read this paragraph again for everybody's comfort. But the tragedy is this, that as soon as the gross consciousness of the soul tends to reach the 0 point of equilibrium, the balance that Baba described in the earlier paragraph, by gradually experiencing the predominant opposite impressions, it so happens that the consciousness of the soul invariably gets too engrossed in experiencing the predominant opposite impressions and experiences them or exhausts them to such a degree that these predominant opposite impressions are now reduced, that is, through experience, to such a level that those impressions which are overbalanced by the original predominant opposite impressions now become predominant, and a great disturbance of balance or equipoise occurs. Wherefore, consciousness, acting like the indicator at the fulcrum, swings or switches in just the opposite direction of its original experience. So the balance switches. It is at this juncture that the consciousness.
This needs an explanation because this
Go ahead.
is important. What he means is basically you become unconscious and you acquire more reflection. Okay, reflection which is not known to you.
Now
Okay.
that's a new word, right? What do you mean by reflection?
Reflection is the experience to be taken. The other part, what he says, opposite impressions. Opposite impressions are basically reflections. What is not?
Oh, okay. So you're saying the alter impression. So I have a impression, and the alter impression attracts me. By that you refer to reflections. Is that what
Okay,
you're saying?
so one is unconsciously acquiring more impressions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This is what it means. There is accumulation of more impressions rather than a short. This he has mentioned further somewhere about unconsciously
Acquiring impressions.
So you go ahead, please.
Okay. It is at this juncture that the consciousness of the soul turns towards the experience of the newly predominant opposite impressions through another human form. A human being takes form or birth as a medium to satisfy the demanding need of the consciousness of the soul, which now seeks to exhaust or spend or experience the more predominant opposite impressions. It is but natural that the predominant qualities of manifested now by this human soul will be in accordance with the predominant opposite impressions of which this new human form is but the mold. It is but natural that the predominant qualities manifested now by this human soul will be in accordance with the predominant opposite impressions of which this new human form is but the mold. Okay. Thus, in the process of reincarnation, the fully gross conscious human soul, fortified with fully developed subtle and mental bodies, though unconscious of these, must necessarily experience countless varied experiences of impressions of opposites, the impressions which are diametrically opposite, in a chain of unending experiences. So I have a question here. So I'm struggling with the idea of opposites, right? So are you suggesting that, let us say, I have an impression which wants me to um, enjoy music, right? Or I'm attached to learning music. Is there an opposite impression to that? Anyone? Because how would that determine my next how is that an opposite? So if I have impression that makes me want to become a singer, I exhaust that by probably taking another reincarnation where I become a singer, right? But how is that an opposite? That's what I'm struggling with.
Well, I think you have to look at the context. Um, I think you'll have to look at the context of the situation. For
Mm-hmm.
example, you look at in the book on discourses on where Baba talks about sex and marriage,
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
somebody is very lustful and he wants to kind of, be less lustful, wants to suppress, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have an opposite side, suppression and, indulgence, two
Mm-hmm.
opposite things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it depends on the situation. Like, just because you want to enjoy music, as long as you're not attached to anything, that is the most important aspect of sanskaras. Is that when you do vipassana, what you learn is observe, don't react to pleasant sensation. So today morning, if you had coffee, the best coffee of your life, you can enjoy the coffee, but if you put an impression in your mind that tomorrow I would like to have the same
Same
coffee
coffee.
again, then
No,
you
that's
have that
fine. So
coffee.
that's not what we're talking about here, right? So I'm only struggling with this repeated reference to balance and opposites. So he talked in the last paragraph as well about this, that
Correct.
the balance is the reason why we take another birth, right? So I think it may be getting clarified further down, but I think let's reflect on this and get back
I
if we get any other insights.
See,
I
there
had
is another way. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I had tried to explain this with the help of the karmic theory, right? But
Mm-hmm.
since it is not mentioned by Baba, and since nothing that is mentioned by Baba, I will not like to speak.
Fair
Otherwise,
enough.
there
So
is an
I
explanation.
No, no, fair enough. I am also trying to steer clear of that. So that's why
If
I use
God
the
speaks,
example. So my
for what I
example is, yeah, go ahead, Tushar.
for what I feel, God speaks is written in a very it's an outline of something more complex. This for more lay Baba lovers. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
God Speaks has been written. I think there are perhaps other literature which has more detail. I read a part of discourses, and I'm very sure it is in detail. You will have to read further more beyond God Speaks if you want certain answers.
Fair enough.
Uh,
With that, we'll park it. If anybody gets some more insights, please jump in either later or tomorrow. I will also try to listen to what Ivy Do says on this chapter during her from her lectures, and if I'm able to get to it today, I will comment to everybody tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. So I'll get back to the paragraph that we were. So it is but natural that the predominant qualities manifested now by this human soul will be in accordance with the predominant opposite impressions of which this new human form is but the mold. Thus, in the process of reincarnation, the fully gross conscious human soul, fortified with fully developed subtle and mental bodies, though unconscious of these, must necessarily experience countless varied experiences of impressions of opposites, the impressions which are diametrically opposite in a chain of unending experiences. Through its association with the gross body, the soul seeks to exhaust its previously accumulated opposite impressions, but rarely succeeds in doing so. On the contrary, it often accumulates fresh impressions of opposites. When the gross form is about to exhaust the impressions which brought it into existence, it is dropped. The residual opposite impressions lead the soul to heaven or hell in accordance with the predominance of virtue or vice. In discarnate existence also, all opposite impressions seek to be exhausted. Through the subjective, I'll read this again. In discarnate existence also, all opposite impressions seek to be exhausted through the subjective experiencing of vivified impressions. There are two new words I didn't understand, discarnate and vivified, but I'll park it there. But even here, in the state of heaven or hell, the equipoise of impressionless is generally approximated but missed. Okay, the equipoise of impressionless is generally approximated but missed, and the residual predominant opposite impressions goad the consciousness of the soul to associate with the new gross medium. Okay, complete equipoise is lacking in depth as well as in birth. It can only be achieved in the gross world. Therefore, an endless chain of lives in the gross sphere is sustained by residual impressions until consciousness succeeds in getting established in impressionless equipoise. Right? I'll read on if there's no interruption. At every stage and in every state of reincarnation, the consciousness of the fully human conscious soul gets firmly centralized in the more and more concentrated impressions of human forms with which it has identified and from which it has disassociated. There seems to be no escape from these concentrated impressions. There seems to be these impressions must be experienced and exhausted. And the more the impressions are experienced, the more the impressions become concentrated. The only solution to thin out this concentration of impressions is for the consciousness of the fully human conscious soul to experience increasingly and more rapidly these impressions in such a way and in so great a frequency that every impression experienced and the impression that this experience created should be counterbalanced somehow by an opposite impression. Okay, so I think he's describing in the footnote impressions. That's what it was, right? There seems to be no escape. Okay, he's talking about the principle being all pervasive. I'll read the footnote. Knowing that creation is not an accident and that it has a deeper meaning than is apparent to the eye, the seers of all age have time and again drawn the attention of the world to the fact that although for a certain period of his life on this planet, man may identify himself exclusively with the life of the senses, his transcendental destiny is God realization. Maulana Rumi, in his Masnavi, has a parable that illustrates this. The cub of a tiger happened to be reared amongst a flock of sheep. As the cub grew up, it developed all the traits of the sheep and grazed and bleated like them, so that it never thought of itself as anything different from the sheep. One day, however, a tiger from the jungle approached the one from the flock and said to him, "Do you know that you are a tiger like me and not one of the sheep?" Thereafter, he coaxed the strayed tiger to look at its image in a rivulet nearby and succeeded in enlightening it as to its true nature. The moral of this fable is that man also allows himself to be identified with the world of the senses and seems to have no way of escape. But there is a way of escape. For eventually a master appears who enlightens him. He is then redeemed and finds himself in the course of time face to face with his ultimate goal, God realization.
So there is an escape available.
Yes.
Yes.
So wait for the master to take you to the rivulet.
Yes.
Throughout the process
That is not escape. It's in fact creating more impressions. Okay,
no,
we'll
but
come to that.
your goal is to get to an impression-less state, right? So the process of dislodging or exhausting your impressions and moving toward that impression-less state will be with the help of a master. So it does not start new impressions, but it's a journey.
It's not, see, all this, the whole path is not so easy as you think. Very,
Yes.
very tough path. This Baba has acknowledged himself. So I just want you to see that don't take it very lightly. These sanskaras getting atoned is not a simple thing.
True.
Right now, because this is for us to make us understand, he has written in a very simple language. And he's trying to get you into this, make you familiar with sanskaras. But you, as an experience, are treading into unknown territory, which is not easy. Getting into unknown is the biggest problem with experience. Go
True.
ahead, please.
Yeah. Throughout the process of reincarnation, this play of balancing and counterbalancing the opposites of impressions continues. And on this play is sustained the reincarnation process. On this play depends the eventual emancipation of the human conscious soul from the chains of ignorance and the ultimate realization of the self consciousness. Thus, in the process of reincarnation, fully gross conscious human soul must necessarily experience innumerable and diverse experiences of impressions of opposites, the impressions which are diametrically opposite in an apparently unending chain of consistent experiences. Therefore, while the gross conscious human soul, which is now fully conscious, undergoes the experience of opposites in the gross world, the consciousness of the soul has to identify or reincarnate itself a number of times as a male, then as a female, and vice versa, in varied castes, creeds, nationalities, colors, and in different places, as rich one time and then as a pauper, sometimes healthy and sometimes sick, and so forth, and all the while reviewing opposite impressions, creating opposite impressions, and simultaneously exhausting them by opposite experiences. It is only through these diverse opposite impressions and their respective opposite experiences that the gross conscious human soul in the gross world could possibly one day, after millions of births and deaths, and through these opposite experiences of births and deaths, be able to balance or thin out the residual or concentrated opposite impressions.
Just
It
read the
is,
last three lines again.
yeah, it is only through these diverse opposite impressions and their respective opposite experiences that the gross conscious human soul in the gross world could possibly one day, after millions of births and deaths,
After
and
millions of births and deaths, just under this,
yeah,
billions of births and deaths, which
yeah,
means it is not an easy path.
correct. And through these opposite experiences of births and deaths, be able to balance or thin out the residual or concentrated opposite impressions. I'll take a minute to go to the footnote. It's a small one. Sarapa arzu hone ne banda कर दिया हमको सरपा अर्जू होने ने बंदा कर दिया हमको बगरना हम खुदा थे गर दिली बे हुआ होता Mir Taki, the fact that I am weighed down from head to foot with desires has made a slave of me. I should be God in reality, where my heart and mind desireless. Okay, nice. It is the cycle of deaths and consequent births of human forms that ultimately results in inciting the fully evolved consciousness of the gross conscious human soul to involve this consciousness to the depth where the fully involved consciousness of the soul realizes the reality of the infinite, eternal state of the self. page 40. This process of involution of consciousness gradually takes place as the gross impressions of the opposites gradually become fainter and less concentrated. At this stage, the consciousness of the gross conscious human soul gradually gets disassociated from the gross world as the involution of the consciousness infolds and gradually disassociates from experiencing the impressions of the gross world. This involution of gross consciousness is only possible when the opposite impressions gradually, after a very, very long process, thin out through the process of unfailing reincarnation of gross impressions of the opposite and gross experiences of the opposites. So experience. So with that, we go to part 5, the planes. Anything to be discussed before we on reincarnation before we go? I'm still gray on this opposite bit. I continue to be gray on that. I will come back with what I find if I can find about an hour.
I'll explain to you later on.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll explain to you.
Maybe it's not just me. Others need it too. So you have a
Yeah,
fight.
it will be explained here on a Saturday.
Okay, done. Perfect.
Please mark this question.
Done. Part 5, the planes. Involution of liberating consciousness. When the consciousness of the soul is ripe for disentanglement from the gross world, it enters the spiritual path and turns fainter or more subtle, with the result that the soul now becomes subtle conscious. This is the first step in the involution of consciousness, which is striving for liberation from the burden of impressions. A number of cycles of births and deaths in the human form have to contribute towards that ripeness of gross experience, which ultimately propels the consciousness of the soul onto the path of liberating involution, on which impressions become fainter and fainter and eventually disappear. Gross impressions become subtle impressions. Subtle impressions become mental impressions. And mental impressions are ultimately wiped out, leaving consciousness free to reflect the truth. Please go on mute all the others who are not speaking. The process of involution is generally gradual. Man's heritage of form as well as impressions is from animals. So the gross impressions are very strong. In extremely rare cases, the gross impressions can suddenly disappear and the freed consciousness of the soul experiences the oversoul. But it is more usual for the gross impressions to become fainter and fainter, thus getting converted into subtle and mental impressions, and then fade away completely. As a general rule, the soul, which has started on its homeward journey, does not come back to the gross world in which it had lost itself as if in a wilderness. This does not mean that the subtle conscious soul does not take a gross form or dwell in the gross world with its gross body. It means that the consciousness of the soul is no longer entangled with the gross form or the gross world, and that it is chiefly engrossed in the subtle world. As a general rule, the soul first snaps its link with the gross world, then with the subtle world, and lastly with the mental world, and comes to realize itself as beyond all these. While it traverses this path, it crosses 6 planes, of which the first 3 belong to the subtle world, and the fourth is on the borderline of the subtle and the mental worlds, whereas the fifth and sixth belong to the mental world. The soul, abiding everlastingly in the oversoul, is beyond all planes. First and second planes. As the gross consciousness of the gross conscious human soul gradually involves, this involving gross consciousness experiences partially the first plane of the subtle world through the medium of the fully developed subtle body of the soul. At this stage, the involved gross consciousness of the gross conscious human soul gets the first glimpses of the first plane of the subtle world and experiences these glimpses or impressions partially through the gross body and partially through the subtle body. Here, both the gross and the subtle senses are used simultaneously. This is the stage when it is said that the human soul stands, as it were, on the line of demarcation as shown in the sketch, which demarks the gross world from the subtle world. The consciousness of this human soul experiences strange things. With the gross eyes, he sees glimpses of the subtle plane. With his gross ears, he hears celestial music of the subtle plane. And with his gross nose, he enjoys subtle scents. In short, the gross conscious human soul, partially on the first plane of the subtle world, experiences subtle impressions, but with gross senses. Gradually, before that, do you want to see the image on page 55? We'll come back. So this is the line. So he's saying that with gross nose, eyes, ears, experiences subtle smell, sights, and sounds. So that's the first borderline between gross world and first plane. Gross world includes universes, visible and invisible, imbibing energy from subtle world through gross aspects of energy such as nuclear, solar, etc. Imbibing the aspects of the mind of the mental world such as desires, thoughts, emotions. So first plane is where we are here. Let us go back. Gradually, with further involution of gross consciousness, the gross conscious human soul experiences completely the first plane of the subtle world. Now, the gross conscious human soul is no longer gross conscious, but he is subtle conscious. This subtle conscious human soul gradually becomes conscious of the second plane of the subtle world. This subtle world is the domain of infinite energy, the infinite power of God, which, when translated into the finite, here manifests in the form of the infinite energy of the subtle world. The subtle world is a domain of infinite energy, the infinite power of God, which then translated into the finite here manifests in the form of infinite energy of the subtle world. When in human form, the soul has subtle consciousness. It is unconscious of the body, gross and mind or the mental body. But it does work through the gross body and through the mind, which is the mental body, not directly, but on the subtle plane. So, even if the subtle conscious human soul is unconscious of the gross body and mental body and therefore does not realize the gross and mental worlds, he can use the gross body through various aspects of the gross, such as eating, drinking, sleeping, seeing, feeling, hearing, etc. And he can use the mental body through various aspects of mind, mental body, such as desires, thoughts, and emotions. The subtle conscious human soul on the second plane with greater involution of consciousness is gradually gaining consciousness of the infinite energy of the subtle world and is capable of performing tricks or minor miracles of lower degree. For instance, with one wish, he can make a dry tree green and vice versa. He can stop railway trains and motor cars, fill a dry well with fresh water, and so forth. This subtle conscious human soul on the second plane experiences the subtle world with the subtle senses of his subtle body. He is now totally unconscious of the gross world, although from all outward appearances, he remains and functions as an ordinary man, eating, sleeping, and having feelings of pain and pleasure, etc. Yet, actually, his involving consciousness experiences not the gross world, but the subtle world and creates fresh subtle impressions only of the sights, scents, and sounds of the subtle world. Third plane. Further involution.
Yeah, let me interrupt a bit.
Sure.
Talking of the tricks, right? Oh, just go above.
Yeah.
Just go above in the.
Here it is. For instance,
Okay, and see it. Okay, so this ability to perform tricks. Okay, you will be tempted to do this. That's not our approach. Okay, this is known as a phenomena. This is a part of a phenomena. So we should not be entangled here. He's just mentioning that you'll get stuck here if you do that. If you stop a train, you will create nuisance cars. Our goal is to finally reach the capital self.
correct.
So go ahead. Talking of this all along.
Correct. With that, let's go to the third plane. Further involution of the subtle consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul makes the soul experience the third plane of the subtle world. Here, the subtle consciousness gains greater consciousness of the infinite energy of the subtle world, and the soul experiences greater finite power. Here, he is capable of performing grand miracles, such as giving sight to the blind and restoring limbs. Please go on mute. I keep hearing feedback, which is. Here, he is capable of performing grand miracles, such as giving sight to the blind and restoring limbs to the maimed. Here, this subtle conscious human soul is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle sphere. Just as a gross conscious human soul is capable of traveling from Asia to Australia or America using the gross vehicles at his disposal. The second and third planes of the subtle sphere are the two major planes which are solely in the domain of the subtle sphere. The first plane is partially in the domain of the subtle sphere and partially in the gross sphere. Similarly, the fourth plane is partially of the subtle sphere and partially of the mental sphere. The fourth plane is known as the threshold of the mental sphere. Fourth plane. With a gradual and further gain in the involution of the consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul, the consciousness of the soul inclines the soul to experience the fourth plane. On the fourth plane, the soul is fully conscious of infinite energy. It is the very same infinite energy which is the shadowy aspect of that infinite power of God. Here, the soul is equipped with full power and is even capable of raising the dead and of creating new forms and worlds, breathing with life. On the fourth plane, there are no occult powers, they are divine powers. As shown in the sketch facing page 55, the subtle conscious human soul on the fourth plane, possessing the key to the store of infinite power, is seen on the threshold of the mental world, confronted by the full blast of intense desires and emotions, which are the aspects of the mind of the mental world. At this stage, the soul experiences, as it were, a state of the darkest night. He finds himself caught between the devil and the deep. The overpowering incitement of by intense desires to wield and use this infinite energy at will provides a treacherous foe at this juncture when the involution of consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul is unfailingly progressing rapidly towards gaining mastery over all desires. So at the fourth plane, desires bother you even then. So the footnote here is on creating new forms and worlds. the Vignan conscious souls of Kutub state or perfect masters control such a happening and see that gross mishaps do not come to pass unless preordained. Gross mishaps created by creativity of somebody having infinite power.
That is what I was referring to.
So you can't do something which goes against nature. So obviously the perfect masters ensure that gross mishaps are stopped unless they are preordained. If these desires at their zenith overpower the soul on the fourth plane, and if the powers are misused, then the experience of liberating this infinite energy invariably proves fatal at this juncture for the soul on the fourth plane. The result is that all of the consciousness gained by the soul is violently disintegrated, and the soul retains only the most finite consciousness and identifies itself once again with the stone form. My God. The soul then has to pass through the whole process of evolution from the stone form onward to regain full consciousness. What a fall. The soul of the fourth plane has semi-subtle and semi-mental impressions. He is subject to the most tantalizing temptations because he has intense and overpowering desires, good or bad. Being in possession of tremendous power, he is impelled to make good or bad use of it. If he misuses his power for the satisfaction of lust or for the sake of craving for name and fame or for some other low purpose, there is a sudden fall of this consciousness of the soul, causing it to revert to the stone stage of consciousness. But if, by overcoming his temptations, he makes good use of his tremendous powers, or does not make any use of his powers, he goes into the fifth plane, where he is safe and has no possibility of downfall. But also, if he makes good use of the powers, he is sometimes pulled up into the sixth plane by Vigyan conscious souls of the Kutub state or perfect masters, but not Jivan Muktas nor Majzoobs. Good use of power in the gross world may be directed towards material and spiritual ends. For example, wealth might be spent for the material well-being of others, as for charitable hospitals, relief for the starving and the distressed, etc., or for their spiritual well-being by providing them with spiritual instruction and spiritual possibilities. But in the fourth plane, good use of the powers consists in harnessing them only for spiritual well-being of others. These powers can never be used to bring about material prosperity for anyone. That definitely is a bad use. We might take the following as an example of good use of the powers of the fourth plane. Suppose a spiritual pilgrim is going through a desert and is at the point of death due to unquenchable thirst. The soul of the fourth plane can appear to him in the gross body and give him relief by giving him a jug of water and then disappear. Such use can be termed good use. Powers can be used for individual or collective good, but even good use binds and arrests the further progress of the soul. That is why the fourth plane
Okay,
is the
here
most
he is
difficult.
talking. Let me. Now here he is talking of karma. Okay, the word binds is nothing but. Okay. You better.
Yeah, I'll connect.
Okay. So if you have good deeds, you have acquired sanskaras. So you again have to take birth, whatever state you are in. Okay. So you have to use what is known as choiceless consciousness. He has mentioned for this book itself about nirvikalp. Nirvikalp means choiceless. Okay, as we read the whole thing, we will understand. I'm just pointing out that here is what he is meaning that.
Correct, but here he is making that reference to a point to a person who's very, very evolved already, right? So
Yeah, but he has not transcended the tremors of birth and
yeah, correct, correct.
yeah. He's still not in the immortal soul.
Correct. Correct. Powers can be used for individual or collective good, but even good use binds and arrests the further progress of the soul. That is why the fourth plane is the most difficult to cross and is fraught with greatest dangers. The person who is stationed on the fourth plane finds it, finds it most difficult to abstain from wielding the tremendous powers at his command for the fulfillment of his overpowering desires. The fourth plane is the threshold of the mental world. On this plane, more than on any other subtle plane, the spiritual pilgrim is particularly susceptible to having a precipitous fall. The crisis which confronts the soul of the fourth plane is grave and hazardous because he comes into the possession of stupendous divine powers before having brought his mind into complete subjugation. He cannot control his mind completely because unless and until he rises into the fifth plane, which is of the mental world, he cannot directly experience or use his mind. Like the gross conscious human soul, the subtle conscious soul of the fourth plane also uses his mind indirectly. Now, on the fourth plane, the mind is fully alive. It is functioning in all its fully developed aspects of thoughts, feelings, and desires, which are at its zenith of their overwhelming intensity. On the one hand, the soul is trying to gain mastery over its own insurgent mind and bring into subjugation the subversive forces of desires let loose. On the other hand, the limitless energy of the planes is completely at his disposal and is constantly seeking some expression or use. If the soul yields to the overpowering temptations to put his powers to wrong use, there is an enormous psychic crash of unimaginable magnitude. The explosive forces thereby released bring about a complete disintegration of consciousness, subjecting it to a cataclysmic downfall from the heights of the subtle consciousness of the fourth plane to the very lowest depths of rudimentary stone consciousness, which the soul experienced in the very beginnings of evolution. This psychic cataclysm of disintegration is comparable to the fusing of an electric bulb due to an irreparable short circuit. The fallen soul has now no alternative except that of again going through the long and laborious ascent of evolving consciousness through ages of evolution and reincarnation through numberless forms, and then again gradually and patiently ascending through the planes. This disintegration of consciousness occurs only in the case of fourth plane consciousness, and that too rarely, only when the powers of the fourth plane are misused. It is a fact normally that when consciousness is once gained, it can never be lost. But the case of fourth plane consciousness is the one exception. If the soul does not misuse the powers at its command, if the soul does not misuse the powers at his command, but uses them for good without being overpowered by desires, then, with further involution of consciousness, the consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul sometimes experiences directly the sixth plane of the mental world and skips over the experiences of the fifth plane of the mental world. But if this consciousness of soul on the fourth plane of consciousness neither uses nor misuses the power of the fourth plane, then gradually, with further involution of consciousness, the subtle conscious human soul on the fourth plane crosses the threshold of the fourth plane and enters the mental world on the fifth plane, fifth and sixth planes. With greater involution of consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul on the fourth plane, the consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul identifies itself with mind of the mental planes and experiences the mental world. This mind of the mental planes has two sections. In the first section, the state of mind is inquiring or reflecting. In this state, mind functions as thoughts, high thoughts, low thoughts, good thoughts, bad thoughts, material thoughts, spiritual thoughts, and so forth. So entry into the, so fifth plane, entry into the mental world comprising the fifth and sixth planes may be compared to an entry into a room after crossing the threshold, the fourth plane of consciousness. Okay, the threshold is the fourth plane. We'll go to the, after we finish the planes, we'll go and spend some time on the diagram. So
Since transcending the mind is a major barrier.
Correct.
And this is what we use. It is such a paradox that we have to use mind to annihilate the mind. It's a paradox. And anything beyond mind is purely it's imagination. I mean, it's difficult to grasp, think, or anything.
True. In the second state of mind, in the second section, the state of mind is impressive or sympathetic. In this state, mind functions as feelings. Feelings of sufferings, emotions, feelings of desires, longings, feelings of pangs, separation, and so forth. When mind of the mental world has distinct dual functions, it is necessary that the experiences in the field of mind, the mental world, must be distinctly of two kinds also. Thus, the mental world has two domains, the domain of the fifth plane of consciousness of thoughts and the domain of the sixth plane of consciousness of feelings. Therefore, the consciousness of the mental conscious human soul on the fifth plane identifies with the first section of mind only and is conscious of that state of mind which is inquiring or reflecting mind. Thus, this mental conscious human soul of the fifth plane is creator and master of thoughts and is capable of controlling only the thoughts of all gross and subtle conscious souls. This is often interpreted as controlling the minds of gross and subtle conscious souls. He does not control the mind as a whole, but controls only that state of mind which functions as thoughts only. The mental conscious human soul on the fifth plane of consciousness, while identifying himself as inquiring or reflecting mind, emanates only thoughts, does not identify himself with the second state of mind, and is therefore incapable of establishing mastery over feelings, emotions, and desires. However, with greater involution of consciousness, the mental conscious human soul of the fifth plane gains consciousness of the second state of mind of the mental world in the sixth plane and thus tends to identify himself as that mind in the second state, the impressive or sympathetic mind. Thus, the consciousness of the mental conscious human soul has involved sixth plane consciousness of the mental world. The difference between involving consciousness of the fifth and sixth planes may be compared to the difference between the angles of vision of a man entering a room, the mental world. On entering the room, if the man looks straight ahead of him, he spontaneously sees God face to face, thereby gaining direct consciousness of the sixth plane. But if his vision happens to focus on one of the corners of the room, then he first gains only the consciousness of the fifth plane. The mental conscious human soul of the sixth plane consciousness of the sixth plane consciousness experiences, actually let me stop at end of page 48 and go to the diagram so that we relate at least till fourth plane on the diagram. Okay, so we saw up to the first plane here. So here he gains consciousness of energy in the second plane. We are still in the subtle world. gains consciousness of a greater consciousness of energy in the third plane. Fourth plane is the plane between subtle and mental world. Fully conscious of energy, full power, and threatened by overpowering aspects of the mind, crosses the fourth plane. There are two planes here. Like he said, if I see God at the threshold, I go straight to the sixth plane. If I don't, I go through the process of the consciousness of the first state of mind, that is thoughts, and controls only thoughts. Then I move to the sixth plane, which is fully conscious of the second state of mind and master of minds of all, the creator and controller of feelings, desires, and emotions. And this is, of course, the mental world. So, with that, we'll go to the seventh plane and God state tomorrow. So, it's as you can see, people heating up, a lot of things to internalize, understand, and move on. Any
Yeah,
comments before we wrap up?
you
Kama,
should
you've been
have.
silent.
Kama will have a joke for us.
Joke. I think what I wanted to say here was that when you're talking about sanskaras here, that we have to go through all the opposites. And what I've understood is that, do you want to get addicted to something once or 100 times? So that is where you go through millions of births. But if you have the guidance of a perfect master, then we can reduce the number of cycles of births. So in that sense, I think we are on the other side of the fence. We have Avatar Meher Baba as our guide, but it's only 1% inspiration, right knowledge. 99% perspiration, right action is up to us. So this is where the biggest challenge is. And if you are lucky to meet a living perfect master, then you have to just surrender. And right now, Baba said that for the first 100 years of manifestation after his dropping his body, he is the only supreme Sadguru available right now. And we can only connect with him directly.
Correct.
So that is my take on that. Yeah.
I just had one other point. I didn't want to interrupt the flow because it was a tangent at that time, but maybe I'll bring it up now. Bindingless action. I like this expression used by Dayananda Saraswati very much, because I think it's a good use of semantics, but it's very powerful. He says freedom in action, right? So if you reflect on it, then you'll realize what he's trying to say. But basically, it's the ability to perform an action without any binding. So it complete freedom in action. So he uses that frequently, and I think that's a very nice way of understanding how to be disconnected from bindings in our action. Action is inevitable, but then how do we be free in that action? To be free, we have to be choiceless. We have to be binding free, right? So easier said than done. I'm just making the point.
Choiceless
Not that
here.
I have freedom in action. I'm
In
bound.
what you have just said, the difference is that of will and desire. Okay. What he's
Correct.
talking of is use your will, and that's not easy for
It's
us.
not easy.
As Kama said, we are on the other side. We are pretty much in the gross world. Pretty much.
Correct.
Using a will is much, much tough. We are only using our desire, and if we think we are using will, we are fooling ourselves.
True.
So this use of desire keeps us binding.
True. Good. So let's catch up again tomorrow. Jai Baba.
Jai
Jai
Baba.
Baba.
Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.